On the 23rd of July, Moscow's train stations were bombed. Trains have collapsed. The Leningradsky and Paveletsky stations in the capital of Mordor have come under attack by the armed forces of Ukraine. Operation Web is ongoing. Muscovites are in chaos and a total evacuation is underway.
This is a kind of mess happening at Paveletsky station. I called Russian Railways and they said, we've fixed everything, there are no delays, come on over. But over there, it's a total crash.
The railway is right by the bridge.
Bada boom! Moscow's trains have been blown up. Hundreds are trapped under the rubble. The platform is filled with smoke. Evacuation of the railways.
Near Vaygonichi. A message. Moscow, Volgograd, dear passengers.
132 trains to Crimea and the Caucasus have been delayed. The entire southern railway of Russia has come to a halt. People are lying on the floor in panic. There's no water, it's hot, everyone's hysterical. The evacuation is starting.
Yes.
And this is Sheremetyevo and Vnukovo. 5,000 flights have been cancelled there. Passengers are being given inflatable mattresses so they can sleep right on the floor.
It feels like after the show The Last Hero, I'm now in the series Lost. According to the board, we've been in there for 23 hours already, but it's all an illusion, we're still here. One more attempt to finally get out. This time we're going to make it. I thought there would be fewer people at Sheremetyevo. Apparently, the airport handed out mattresses to those who have been waiting a long time.
There's panic, total chaos. It's impossible to live. It's hell heat, stuffiness, shouting, kids on the floor, no water. People are sleeping on the concrete. Instant noodles and a bottle of water for 3 people. That's all they've given out in more than a day. Ukrainian Armed Forces drones continue to attack Russia, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. This has been going on for the 4th day now. We'll discuss all of this with Roman Svitan. Breaking news, friends. The Ukrainian Armed Forces are striking Russia's critical infrastructure. Moscow is on fire. St. Petersburg is paralyzed. At night, hundreds of drones flew toward the capital. There were explosions in Zelenograd. Cars are burning. People are in panic. Russian air defense is shooting down drones with apartment buildings. The airports in Moscow and St. Petersburg are a whole different story. They're simply not operating. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled. Passengers are sleeping on the floor. There's no connection, no internet. The FSB is cracking down on all of this. Fights have broken out. Trains to Crimea and the Caucasus have been delayed for a whole day. It's hell. Heat, stuffiness, shouting, no water. It's a collapse in Russia. Stations have burned down. Air defense is firing at drones but hitting the power lines. People are in hell. They're not eating. Heat, shouting. Meanwhile, at railway stations in Moscow and other regions of Russia, there is collapse, panic, evacuation, and stampede. 132 trains have been delayed. We are attacking not only military airfields, but also Russia's railway hubs and arteries. No one knows where to go. And Mayor Sobyanin reports another 16 drones shot down with his bare hands or with a net. What's going on? The Ukrainian Armed Forces are breaking the enemy's logistics. And this is just the beginning. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with the aviation collapse. What's happening? We're intensively bombing the Moscow region and Moscow, and here's what happens.
It's shelling. Bombing is when aerial bombs are dropped from bombers onto the ground. That's bombing. We're shelling. We have long-range strike capabilities for now. Drones are being used, and we're still waiting for ballistic missiles to finally appear. We've been promised ballistic missiles for several years now, at least for our Chromis. In theory, they should be able to reach Moscow as well. So we keep waiting. They say a promised thing is waited for 3 years. They promised us since last year. Well, we'll wait another 2 years or so. I think by then the ballistic missiles will finally arrive. But for no while, we're waiting for the ballistics. Our Lyuti drones are mainly operating against Moscow and military targets in the Moscow region, either the Bobry or the Lyuti. The Lyuti is a very good drone. It's the AN-196. Antonov is producing it in large quantities paid for by our partners. Europe paid several $100 million specifically for production, with manufacturing taking place outside of Ukraine. So the Russians can't get to it. That's why in this regard, everything is good for us. Everything is excellent. The only thing is the numbers are increasing now. Why? Why? Because you can't break through to Moscow with just a small number of drones. In Moscow, especially Moscow, there is a serious objective air defense system in place. And as soon as we break through the frontline air defense, and the Russians' frontline air defense is still full of holes. So as soon as we break through it and a sufficient number of drones enter Moscow, especially the Moscow region, then naturally, in addition to carrying out combat missions and destroying military targets, what you mentioned also happens: collapse, panic, children crying for a moment, and some truck driver is hauling something somewhere. This happens at airports, but these are, so to speak, accompanying problems. The main problem for the Russians, of course, is the strikes by our drones on military targets in this direction. Finally, Moscow has stopped being the so-called sacred cow. Remember how much we used to joke about it. We used to avoid Moscow and the Kerch Bridge by a wide margin. So the Kerch Bridge is still being avoided, as are the oil refineries for some reason. But attacks on Moscow and the Moscow region have become much more frequent. They've become frequent. And we're waiting. First of all, we're waiting for ballistic missiles, of course, and we're also watching for an increase in the number of drones heading in that direction. Let me repeat, they're taking a more strategic approach now, meaning a large number of drones are sent in one direction. Of course, some of them are shot down by Sobyanin. Just the sight of Sobyanin with a butterfly net is enough to make the drones drop dead on their own, no questions asked. You could just put up photos of Sobyanin with a butterfly net all around Moscow, and that would be the main first line of air defense. Still, a certain objective is being achieved, and I think this approach will be scaled up in this direction.
Friends, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I work for a global audience, so people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. Every like, comment, and subscription from you is invaluable. Roman Grigorievich, regarding the Rostov region, at first there was information that the headquarters was blown up there. Which one? Could you give us your assessment? And then it was reported that at night in the Rostov region, a railway junction was on fire, quarries and trains came to a halt. The entire southern railway is paralyzed. What do you say about this?
Well, this is the next operation. That is first, almost all Russian airports were hit by our drones under the command carpet. Naturally, all the Russians rushed to the trains and then, hello, good evening from Ukraine. They were all intercepted in Rostov. So they got an unpleasant surprise twice. I think they'll go back to Moscow, spit, and tell Putin, you should quit this dirty business, this war. Otherwise, we won't get to relax anywhere this summer. Well, that's probably what it's aimed at if you look at it with a bit of irony. But in reality, of course, the military facilities in Rostov will now be targeted, especially from a logistics standpoint. All logistics through Rostov will have to be stopped. Why? Because the Russians have started the second wave of the summer military campaign a few weeks earlier than planned. They had planned it for August, September, but Trump disrupted those plans by moving it up almost a month earlier. And now the Russians are trying to enter the theater of operations at high speed, mainly either through Taman, which is via the Kerch Bridge, through Rostov, the so-called Rostov direction. Right now it's Rostov, Mariupol, and from there they spread out across the entire Donetsk and Zaporizhia front. By the way, the railway is still operational. That's also a big question for our strike capabilities. Why haven't the bridges over the Meuse and elsewhere been destroyed yet? But they've started targeting railway hubs specifically in Rostov. The Russian army is currently advancing in any offensive state, in any form, demonstrating its strategic movement. They consume a large amount of equipment, ammunition, food, and fuel. That is, all of this is mainly transported by rail. In fact, the Russian army's offensive operations are mostly planned along railways. Until the railway is restored, they simply can't advance. They're technically unable to, because there is a huge expenditure of military supplies. Rostov is one of the main transshipment centers, so to speak. Naturally, it is very important for us to completely stop military transport specifically. Why did I speak ironically about intercepting Muscovites who were trying to go to Sochi or, say, to Crimea? In reality, of course, the main task is to intercept specifically Russian military cargoes that are entering the theater of military operations, mainly in the Zaporizhia and Donetsk directions.
Roman Grigorievich, when the footage of that burning headquarters appeared, what could have been burning there in Rostov-on-Don?
Well, in Rostov, it's the headquarters of the army that is actually operating there. Rostov is the center of the southern military district, yes, the southern district, which over the past more than 10 years has launched military operations in our direction. That is naturally the main headquarters structure is there, the infrastructure is packed, Rostov is packed, and the area around Rostov is practically filled with the command system and serves as a major military hub. Now, however, the Russians from Rostov are moving some positions to Mariupol in terms of distance. The thing is, the front line has already moved about 100 kilometers away from Mariupol, and we can hardly reach Mariupol anymore with our main strike weapons, the HIMARS. Mariupol can now only be reached either by drones or by missiles like Storm Shadow, Scalpel, or Neptunes, that is. And they are gradually starting to redeploy from Rostov to Mariupol. So in the near future, we will most likely be hearing about strikes of the same level of Mariupol as well. There are still quite a few headquarters left in Rostov. After all, staff officers, they try to be, well, the staff rats, they try to stay as far from the front line as possible and aren't in any rush to get to Mariupol, fully understanding that it's several dozen kilometers further west and could be hit seriously. And strikes are hitting Rostov too this time. It was quite a decent attack.
Roman Grigorievich, yes, right now everyone is reporting that more than 200 trains have been delayed. People are sitting in the train cars for hours without food or water, and they're complaining, of course, to all the authorities. What's really important is, why can't Russia manage to cover its own skies right now? Why is the air defense only shooting down debris? I've seen that in the Moscow region, drones are constantly crashing into residential buildings because of enemy electronic warfare. And for the first time, Muscovites have been saying that Russian air defense is hitting its own targets. Why is this happening, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, the thing is, this is just the way any army anti-aircraft missile system works. For example, a SAM system doesn't actually see high-rise buildings. It sees, let's say, the target, and it guides the missile toward that target. But if there's a high-rise building in the missile's path, it just pierces right through it, that's all. So that's really what the issue is here. The point is, because of this specificity, Army air defense systems aren't used as site-based defense in cities or populated areas. What is Army air defense actually for? Let's take the Pantsir SAM system as an example of the most prominent representative. By the way, it's an excellent system, truly excellent. Especially now they've started producing a second version with 12 missiles, but with 48, mainly for use against drones. But it's a very good machine. Where is it used? In the fields. Well, for covering troop movements, for protecting certain depots, but in the fields, that's what I mean. It's an army system. They've brought this system into the cities. Naturally, they even installed it, remember, on the Ministry of Defense building in Moscow. They stuck it right on there. But the missile has a range of 18 to 20 kilometers. It can pierce through any high-rise while chasing after some sparrow in the end. It can even spot a sparrow for that matter. But that's exactly the problem for the local population, because as soon as you see a Pantsir or any Russian air defense system somewhere, you'd better kick them out as fast as you can, because they'll cause more problems than any of our drones coming in the warhead. On that drone is 50 kilograms. But when a missile is launched, it also has fragmentation elements designed to destroy aerial targets. That means it's a cloud of fragmentation elements stretching for dozens or even hundreds of meters, tons of thousands of pieces of all kinds, pellets, needles, whatever it's packed with. All of that falls on Russians, on Russian homes. That's why Russians are really facing a big problem, right? Why? Because they can't reinforce the frontal air defense, meaning they can't strengthen their frontline air defenses. They simply don't have enough resources or equipment. They've stretched their forces thin, using point defense mode, spreading out their army's anti-aircraft missile systems and trying to cover certain directions with them wherever they can. They might be able to cover some warehouse, but when they try to shoot down our drones heading for those warehouses with their interceptor missiles, those missiles end up hitting Russian high-rise buildings. That's why Russians are now saying things like ours are shooting at us, but it's not exactly that they're shooting at themselves. The missile really does go for its target. In other words, it targets our drone or our missile but it just ends up hitting something else because of the technical specifics and performance characteristics of the anti-aircraft missile system.
22 kilometers, a new record length for a traffic jam on the Crimean bridge in the 7.5 years since the crossing opened, according to Russian social media channels. About 2,000 cars are stuck in a huge line on the Taman side. According to Mash, people will have to wait in the traffic jam for at least 5 hours. On the Kerch side, everything is calm. Last year's record of a 17-kilometer line has been broken, but there's still half the summer ahead. Roman Grigory, the floor is yours.
The traffic jam was only 1.5 kilometers long, but once word spread that there was a huge jam before the Kerch bridge, all of Crimea went to see it. And that's how it turned into 17 kilometers. That's all there is to it. Well, that's Russians for you. They just don't have any brains. So basically, they ended up trapping themselves in that traffic jam. And now they're stuck, can go forward or back. It's like a one-way valve. You can go in, but you can't get out. That's about it. So now, of course, it's going to take a few days for this traffic jam to clear up. They really did end up with a total collapse. Most likely, when planning their vacations, Russians didn't think that maybe it's not a good idea to vacation in the war zone. There are two things here, two concepts that just don't go together, a war zone and a vacation. Only in the minds of Russians could these two things somehow merge into a single idea. They flock to our territory, our occupied territory, to Crimea and other places, to the Azov coast. They go there to vacation, even though there are battles going on, there's a war happening. Let's put it simply, there are drones flying around, and in the end, missiles flying too. But they still go there, supposedly to relax. Well, you can relax, but only while sitting in 17-kilometer traffic jams. No brains, huh? It would be better if you went somewhere beyond the Urals. Go relax in Siberia, for example. Take a look at how vast Russia used to be, at least before you came along. And now, at this stage, we're seeing this collapse, which is basically caused, of course, by our combat operations. But our combat operations are targeting military facilities, the logistics of the Russians who are now bringing in equipment by rail to the line of contact. So the conclusion is we're actually creating this collapse specifically for Russian military equipment. The Russians are going there to relax with their suitcases. Well, what can you say to them? If you have no brains, you're basically a cripple.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigory, the longest coal conveyor in Russia, stretching 23 kilometers, also caught fire. The fire occurred in the Uglegorsk district of Sakhalin. Who works there?
Well, here we go again. What are we talking about? The Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, Kovalenko, Borodenko, and all the rest of them. We've been living there for 100 years. There are hundreds of thousands of our genetic Ukrainians there. And for them, burning down some coal conveyor, that's a piece of cake. Well, there you go. It burned down. How many times have we already talked about the DPR? And the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic was raised 100 years ago by Ukrainians from Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Tens, even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were resettled there. It was the Green Wedge that was developing that Far Eastern Virgin land back then. At that time, it was called Zakitaishchina. I've been living here for many years, and I've even heard from my own people, my relatives, that is how they took a whole bunch of our people there. Although, to be honest, they weren't really taken there. They went on their own. Why? Because they were giving out land, and people, Ukrainians, hardworking people, naturally developed the whole Green Wedge and put down roots there, of course. Because as soon as the Russians, who appeared out of nowhere, a sort of buffer between Ukraine and the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, started putting pressure on Ukraine itself, naturally, the DNR people rose up and began to burn everything down. We've talked so much with you about how there's almost nothing left there that hasn't already been burned. They burned things down in Komsomolsk-on-Amur too, including an oil refinery, and set fire to several warehouses. They even burned that same coal conveyor belt. In fact, it stretches for several dozen kilometers in length over there. And again, where did the kid get carried away with Operation Web? So it's exactly there, in Ukraanka specifically there, in Chernigovka and Ukraanka, two airfields in the Far East. Guess 3 times where those names came from. One is for tactical aviation Chernigov. Ukraanka is for strategic aviation. By the way, bombers are flying from there now, firing cage 101S at Yuzivan from Ukrainka. They are flying. Our Kovalenkos haven't reached there yet. They'll get there soon enough, and then those planes will have their turn.
Roman Grigorievich, we need to send people who care there so that the Ukrainka airfields work only for the armed forces of Ukraine. Is it possible for them to take off from Ukrainka and go bomb St. Petersburg and Moscow? Now, that's what I call a special operation Web 2. You see, they take off from Ukrainka, from Chernigovka, and head from Moscow and St. Petersburg.
It's possible, definitely possible. Why? Because there are a lot of Ukrainians among the pilots in Russia. You think, well, I studied, granted, that was a long time ago. I graduated in 1985. I've been living for almost 70 years now. So some of my classmates were from Russia, but there were also many Ukrainians, including pilots. That's why, let's put it this way. Later, we'll also remember how our Ukrainians work in Russia on Russian equipment and where they're going to drop those bombs.
Roman Grigorievich, your favorite topic, Zelensky's statement. All available interceptor drones that are effective should be contracted already this week. That's the first point. Second, people should see that Ukraine has its own missiles, Zelensky stated. Overall, regarding weaponry, the goal is to increase our own production so that Ukrainian-made weapons make up 50% of our defense forces' arsenal. And Zelensky also called on Ukraine's Ministry of Defense to increase the frequency and range of drones for strikes on targets in Russia. We already have agreements, hundreds of them, with partners on arms supplies, joint production and investments. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
There are agreements, but no drones. There are agreements, but no missiles. But with this announcement show, many times have we already, I don't even know whether to joke about it anymore or not, right? So there are announcements, but it's like after selling the tickets, you come to the concert and all the performers have run off. That's what it's called. In other words, they made the announcements, sold out, and then disappeared. That's how our circus operates. So at this point, I treat such announcements with caution, that's for sure, because if you don't want to be disappointed later, let's not get our hopes up in the first place. Right now, there really is a shortage of interceptors. There aren't enough of them. It's a good topic, an excellent topic. So they've developed interceptor drones that are about 1.5 times faster than the main Russian drone, the same Jiran, which is Russian Chinese, and these intercept and take them down with a good guidance system. We need to scale up production. Why? Because the Russians, together with the Chinese, again, let me repeat, these are not Iranian Shaheds, of which there were just dozens. This is the Russian Chinese Jiran. There are hundreds of them. And to intercept these hundreds, you need hundreds of the same kind of interceptor drones to accomplish the combat mission. The optimal option is to supply these drones and immediately build up a system of frontal air defense. Why specifically frontal? So that the Russian drones don't cross the front line. Right now, they are flying at altitudes above 1.5 to 2 kilometers, crossing the front, and then descending below the beams of our radars, below the radio horizon. So why are they crossing the front line? Because we practically don't have enough means of distraction at altitudes up to 4 or 5 kilometers, which is where the main part of these Russian drones are currently flying. So that's exactly where we need to saturate and increase the density of air defense, so to speak. It's better to put all the control now in the hands of the drone systems forces. Magyar is working on this, and he can basically create a serious wall of frontal air defense that Russian drones, at the very least, definitely won't be able to cross. So everything depends on him. We need to support. Magyar, if anyone has any means, including financial ones, Magyar can make drones himself. He actually does it himself, which is why financial support is important. For example, if a European initiative to fund drone production emerges, that would be good too. The Danish initiative for the Bogdans was pretty solid. As we remember, we discussed it several times. So such an initiative should also go to SBS, the drone systems forces, to Magyar. And Magyar will practically cover the entire front. It doesn't matter how many there are, hundreds or thousands of drones will get the job done. He's a systematic, methodical leader. He sets the direction, and you can already see that he's starting to make it happen. Already the SBS, our drone systems forces, are eliminating almost 1,000 Russian targets per day. Almost 1,000 per day are being taken out. That means these will also be added there, including Russian drones. And if this issue is resolved in exactly this way, in order to create a frontal control point for Magyar, it will create a serious obstacle will be created for Russian drones. Let me repeat once again, no matter how many there are, they simply won't make it across the front.
Roman Grigory regarding the enemy's capabilities. One of the European generals made a statement that soon Russia will be able to attack Ukraine with up to 2,000 drones per day, several times a week. That they have already greatly increased production of drones, Geran, in the Alabuga economic zone and in Izevsk. What do you say, Roman Grigorievich?
It's China that has increased production. The Russians are assembling them. That is, they have large-scale assembly with really huge open workshops there. So they're not really hiding much, at least for now, since we don't yet have long-range drones of that kind. Well, once we get them, I think we'll reach both Alabuga and Izevsk as well. It's over 1,000 kilometers away. That's not a big problem. It's just before the Urals, up to the Urals. We'll be working on those targets as well. But we have to understand that the Russians, well, for example, now they're going to set up a factory in North Korea. The Chinese are building one in North Korea. And from there, the Gerans will come. So we'll have to reach those as well. That's another 5,000 kilometers on top. So we need to look ahead right away. And ideally, of course, destroy those factories too, the Russian factories, the North Korean factories, and eventually we'll have to reach the Chinese ones as well. Why? Because without destroying the main production facilities for components and assemblies, we won't be able to fully solve this production problem. 2,000? Well, let's look at it technically. War is mathematics. It's calculated very easily. Right now, the Russians are producing about 150 to 200. They can produce 150 to 200 gerans per day, thanks, of course, to the Chinese. So 2,000 principle in a decade, in 10 days, they could theoretically produce that maximum amount, right? So that's how they produce them, let's say, at maximum 200 per day over 10 days. There you have 2,000. The question is, can they launch them all at once? That's the route for starters. Target designation. That means they need to confirm a certain number of targets. Even if it's 2 drones per target, that's still 1,000 targets. Even if it's 10 drones per target, that's still 200 targets. In order to do that, first you need to scout, confirm, plot the route, and so on and so forth. That's a huge amount of work. It's not just about the number of drones that can be launched. It's not only tied to drone production, but also to the entire system of preparation, launch, and support. So at this point, certain laws of so-called warfare come into play. The Russians simply don't have 200 targets at once. And that's assuming they use 10 drones per target, for example. The Russians don't have that many routers to plot routes and carry out the task of this kind. They might be able to do it all at once just to scare someone or to check a box for themselves. But in actual combat operations, that many drones won't be used. No, they won't. In other words, there's no effectiveness in using them that way. The Russians have now figured out a mechanism, basically something we've discussed with you many times, that is several hundred drones in a single day, in a single night. We need to catch up to that level. The Russians have already caught up with the help of the Chinese. So they're going to operate with about 50, 70, up to 100 drones every day. And then they'll hold back, and once a week or twice a week, they might ramp it up to 500 or even 600 drones. But it's not just combat drones. It also includes decoy drones. About half of them are decoy drones. The same Gerbera comes in. I mean, there are also flying boards involved. So these scary stories about 2,000 drones, let's not put them out into the information space just yet. I'll say it again, they simply won't be able to work with them. Technically, it just won't work. At this present moment in time, they have practically reached the absolute maximum capacity, or rather, the most highly optimal and efficient mode of operation in terms of their comprehensive drone production capabilities and their extensive utilization. It's unlikely to increase further because any more would mean efficiency would drop and drop quite significantly, and they won't go for that.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the new wave of the enemy's offensive, the offensive campaign, please give your assessment. You mentioned that it started a bit earlier, specifically because of Trump's position. The floor is yours.
Well, again, it's the same so-called formulas of war. There are certain periods for conducting various campaigns. So the summer military campaign generally begins after the spring rains and ends with the first frost, transitioning into the winter military campaign. If there are no frosts, the summer military campaign continues throughout the entire year. It's not about summer versus winter, it's about temperatures meaning. It's either summer that is positive temperatures or winter that is negative temperatures. There are many different nuances, which is why they call summer and winter military campaigns. For us, summer military campaigns mostly take place during periods of positive temperatures. Again, when preparing for any summer military campaign, it's broken down into periods according to specific objectives. The Russians' objective this year is to expand the land corridor and capture 5 of our regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Crimea. That is, they have practically completely captured Crimea and Luhansk. Kherson is left and the left bank is fully occupied. They won't go to the right, so that leaves Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk regions where they will be operating in the next few months. And the second wave of any summer military campaign usually begins about 1.5 to 2 months after the first. The Russians began their summer military campaign essentially flowing over from the spring months. Before May 9th, they squandered part of their reserves, which is why the first wave of the Russian summer campaign was rather sluggish. But they were mainly preparing for the second wave, which is mostly August, September. Trump pulled the plug, I don't know for what reason, but most likely it's something tied to the autumn developments already happening in geopolitics. In other words, he simply forced Putin to start the second wave earlier. And naturally, the Russians are starting it right now without waiting for August. That's why we began working urgently, for example, on Russian railway logistics in the Rostov area in order to cut off exactly this movement of Russian reserves, which are now being redeployed to the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk directions. Everything is predictable. Our general staff understands this perfectly well, and both Syrskyi and Ignatov know about it and are preparing for it. The fact that Trump played on Putin's side is also clear to everyone. He gave Putin the opportunity to conduct an offensive operation for 2 months in a relatively easy mode, to carry out a military campaign, in fact, to launch the second wave of the summer campaign, just starting it a bit earlier. That's all there is to it. So again, nothing new. The Russians are pushing now, that is, they are bringing up reserves, and soon the equipment will start moving in. But as for the fact that Bankova supplied the Russians with fuel by not destroying Russian oil refineries, well, those are questions for Bankova. They should be sent somewhere to the front lines so that they can meet that fuel together with the tanks, shield it with their own chests, and at least protect Ukraine. After that, they'll think 300 times before deciding whether or not to ensure the safety of Russia's oil refineries.
Roman Grigorievich, I know you always say that it's necessary to strike oil refineries, but what about the current systematic drone attacks on high voltage power lines? In the Moscow, Kaluga, Rostov, and Bryansk regions, there have been recorded outages. A substation has been destroyed. There are power interruptions and traffic disruptions. Is this already a tactic? Can this be considered strikes against Russia's energy sector? Is the goal to bring down the infrastructure?
Well, here we need to understand where exactly the strikes were aimed. Because, well, really, yes, we have to look at all these things realistically. The Russians shoot down most of our drones, especially when they come in a swarm, and in the wreckage of the drone, along with the anti-missiles. Sometimes the anti-missiles are much more dangerous than the drone itself. As I've already mentioned, the Russians have site-based air defense systems, which are deployed using Army anti-aircraft missile complex. So sometimes strikes on Russia's energy sector are actually a consequence, for example, of carrying out a combat mission. They result from the destruction of our drones. Sometimes it really is just debris falling and, for instance, hitting energy infrastructure. If, for example, several drones were heading toward a military facility and were shot down as they approached, they would fall land. Any military facility is also an energy consumer requiring a lot of power. Naturally, the debris can fall on high voltage lines or substations, and all of that can catch fire, which of course leads to a complete shutdown. That's why I wouldn't say with certainty right now that these are our strikes on the energy infrastructure. I think the strikes are still targeting military facilities, and the energy disruptions are just a side effect for now. Why? Because to hit the energy infrastructure, you don't even need that many drones. Why? Because the Russians can't cover all the energy facilities. And Russia's energy supply system is much worse than Ukraine's. We have what's called a cellular system, like a web, if you can imagine it. We have these cells, and even if you knock out one cell, because there used to be so many metallurgical plants and mines, and each mine had to be powered by 3 different electricity sources. And at one time, such a cellular energy supply system was built in Ukraine that is very difficult to take down. But the Russian system is linear. That is, to shut down an entire region, you just need to hit a single line, take out one support, and the whole region, like all of Siberia, could go completely dark. That's this kind of linear system. So honestly, we wouldn't need much to destroy Russia's energy system. In just a few days, all of Russia could be shut down, like turning off the lights in the bathhouse. Almost everything would go dark. Why hasn't this been done yet? Most likely for the same reason we don't strike Russian oil refineries. There's one reason.
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigory and I work for you 3 times a week. In the comments, let us know where you're watching from and leave a few words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine.